The convent doors didn't break open. They closed quietly. No shouting, no flames. Just a written order read aloud in a calm voice. And suddenly every bell stopped ringing. The women inside weren't condemned. They were reassigned. Their vows were declared irrelevant, their lives reclassified as a problem already solved. If you stay, you'll learn how entire communities of Christian nuns were erased without a battlefield, why losing their identity was considered worse than death, and how empires learned that silence and bureaucracy could destroy more completely than violence ever could. If you enjoy this dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. People said I will not reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove them wrong. Comment below where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious to know where this story reach. In the borderlands where empires pressed against one another like shifting shadows, there existed a quiet world that rarely appeared in chronicles of conquest or triumph. A world of stone convents, candlelit prayers, and women who had withdrawn from politics yet found politics unwilling to withdraw from them. And it was here, far from the thrones and banners that defined history's loudest moments, that some of the most unsettling episodes of imperial expansion unfolded, not in spectacle, but in silence. For when the Ottoman frontier expanded across regions shaped by Christian monastic life, the clash was not only military or territorial, but cultural, spiritual, and deeply psychological. And the women who lived behind convent walls had little warning that their vows of separation would one day become the very reason they were targeted. Not as soldiers, not as rulers, but as symbols of a world being dismantled piece by piece. And unlike battles that ended with surrender or retreat, what awaited many of these communities was a slow erasure of identity that contemporaries feared more than finality itself, because death in medieval understanding ended suffering, while loss of self promised something far more disturbing. A continuation stripped of meaning, purpose, and recognition. And the Ottomans, pragmatic and methodical in governance, understood the power of symbols, understanding that institutions shape belief long after walls fall, and convents represented continuity, resistance through faith, and a living memory of a different authority. And so when territories changed hands, these quiet places were rarely ignored. And while the empire's policies varied across time and region, the experience of many nuns followed a chilling pattern, one shaped by displacement, forced transition, and the systematic dismantling of the life they had chosen. And to understand why contemporaries describe this fate as worse than death, one must understand what a nun's life represented in that era, because it was not merely religious devotion, but an identity that governed daily existence, relationships, time, and meaning. And to remove a nun from her convent was not relocation, but unraveling, severing her from vows that defined her reality. And when Ottoman officials arrived at these institutions, they did not always come with visible hostility, sometimes arriving with orders written calmly, efficiently, transforming sacred spaces into administrative concerns, cataloging people as assets, movements as logistics, and futures as variables to be managed. And for the women inside, this bureaucratic quiet was terrifying, because it offered no enemy to confront, no battlefield to flee, only a system that moved forward regardless of prayer or protest. And as convent doors closed for the last time under new authority, the nuns were often dispersed, their communities fractured, their routines interrupted, and this disruption alone carried immense psychological weight, because monastic life depended on continuity, repetition, and shared structure, and without it, the self felt untethered. And in accounts passed down through letters and secondhand reports, there's a recurring theme of disorientation, of women who spoke less about physical hardship and more about silence, about the absence of bells, the loss of ritual, the sudden irrelevance of vows that once gave shape to every hour of the day. And this was the first layer of suffering, one that unfolded quietly but relentlessly. And beyond displacement came transformation, as some were absorbed into new households, expected to adapt to unfamiliar customs, languages, and expectations, not through spectacle or cruelty, but through pressure and inevitability, a system designed to erase distinction over time. And this process terrified contemporaries because it offered no clear end, no martyrdom, no heroic resistance, only slow assimilation that threatened to erase memory itself. And for women whose entire identity was built on separation from worldly life, being forced back into it under conditions they did not choose felt like a violation of the soul, not the body. And medieval writers struggled to articulate this suffering, often describing it as a fate worse than death because it denied both earthly dignity and spiritual closure, trapping the individual between worlds, belonging fully to neither. And as the Ottoman administration solidified control, these stories circulated quietly through surviving Christian communities, whispered warnings rather than public accusations because fear traveled faster than truth. And convents in neighboring regions tightened their rules, prayed longer hours, and prepared internally for a possibility they hoped would never arrive. And yet the empire continued its methodical expansion, indifferent to these fears, guided by strategy rather than sentiment. And in this indifference lay the most unsettling aspect of all, because it revealed how systems of power can cause profound human suffering without malice, without anger, without even acknowledgement, simply by proceeding forward. And as the women affected struggled to reconcile their faith with a reality that no longer recognized it, they became living reminders of what happens when identity is treated as negotiable. And in their quiet endurance, historians later glimpsed a form of tragedy rarely captured in grand narratives, one defined not by violence, but by erasure, not by spectacle, but by the slow collapse of a life carefully built around meaning. And as this story unfolds further, it becomes clear why contemporaries feared this fate so deeply, because it forced individuals to live on without the very framework that made life intelligible. A condition that many believed even the strongest faith was never meant to endure. As the initial shock of displacement settled into a dull, persistent reality, the women who had once lived by bells and candles began to understand that what had been taken from them was not merely a place, but a rhythm of existence that could not be recreated elsewhere. And in the absence of that rhythm, time itself became unfamiliar, stretching strangely without the anchors of prayer hours, shared silence, and collective purpose. And this unfamiliarity bred a quiet anxiety that followed them wherever they were sent, whether into households, distant towns, or temporary quarters, arranged by officials who viewed the matter as resolved once the buildings were repurposed, and yet nothing felt resolved for those who carried the loss internally. Because monastic life was not a profession one could simply leave behind. It was an identity built through years of repetition until it replaced the self entirely. And without it, the mind searched constantly for meaning, only to find the familiar signals absent, and this absence was compounded by language barriers, by unfamiliar customs, by the sense of being perpetually observed, yet never truly seen, as individuals rather than as remnants of a system deemed obsolete. And it was here that contemporaries began to describe the experience as worse than death, because death, in their worldview, ended the struggle and affirmed belief, while this existence prolonged uncertainty indefinitely, forcing the faithful to live within a world that neither understood nor valued the vows that had defined them, and the Ottoman system. Efficient and adaptive, did not require cruelty to achieve this outcome, because its strength lay in normalizing change until resistance faded into fatigue, and for the women affected, fatigue became a constant companion, not the exhaustion of labor, but the deeper weariness of carrying a past that could no longer be lived, and letters that survived from surrounding regions speak not of dramatic confrontations, but of longing for small things. The sound of familiar chants, the comfort of shared silence, the assurance that one's life followed a path recognized by both heaven and earth. And without these assurances, faith itself became a quiet negotiation. No longer supported by structure, no longer reinforced by community, but tested daily by isolation. And while some adapted outwardly, learning new routines, speaking new languages, fulfilling expectations placed upon them, inwardly many described a feeling of suspension, as though they existed between identities, unable to fully return to what they were, yet unwilling to become what circumstances demanded. And this state of suspension was particularly distressing because it offered no clear resolution, no ending that could be mourned and accepted, only continuation without closure, and medieval observers understood this intuitively, recognizing that human endurance is often measured not by how much pain one can withstand, but by how long one can live without meaning. And the stories that circulated reflected this understanding, emphasizing not physical suffering but the erosion of purpose, the slow fading of communal memory, and the fear that the world these women represented would disappear. Not through destruction, but through absorption. And as the empire consolidated its hold, this absorption became more complete. With former convent lands integrated into administrative systems, sacred spaces converted to new uses, and the visible markers of the old life removed or repurposed, making return impossible even in imagination. And this finality deepened the sense of loss because it erased not only the present but the possibility of future restoration, leaving those displaced with memories that could no longer be anchored to place. And in this way, the empire reshaped the landscape not just physically, but psychologically, altering how history itself would be remembered. And the women at the center of these changes became quiet witnesses to a transformation that moved faster than their ability to process it, carrying within them a version of the past that had no public space to exist. And as years passed, some accounts speak of a gradual softening of resistance. Not because acceptance was achieved, but because endurance demanded it, because holding grief indefinitely was unsustainable. And this softening was interpreted by outsiders as adaptation, even assimilation. Yet those who lived it described it differently, as survival stripped to its most basic form, maintaining belief internally while outwardly navigating a world that no longer accommodated it. And this internal division was perhaps the most painful consequence of all, because it fractured the self, forcing a separation between inner conviction and outer reality, a condition that medieval spirituality viewed as deeply troubling. And it is this fracture that gave rise to the language of a fate worse than death, because it implied living on without wholeness, without alignment between faith and life, without the peace promised by either martyrdom or continuity. And as these stories spread quietly through Christian communities, they shaped collective memory, becoming cautionary tales not of conquest, but of what happens when identity is treated as interchangeable, when systems prioritize order over meaning, and when individuals are left to carry the cost of historical change alone, and this cost, invisible to official records, lingered long after borders stabilized, reminding later generations that the most devastating consequences of empire are often not found in battles or ruins, but in the quiet lives forced to continue, after the world that defined them has been carefully, efficiently, and permanently removed.